Yeah, hello everyone. Is my voice audible, guys? Can you guys reply on the chat? Is my voice audible? Great. So today I'm going to cover promises concept in JavaScript. So basically, we are going to understand exactly what is promises in JavaScript and what is the use of these promises, how to create these promises, how to handle these promises. So everything about the promises, let's try to understand in today's session. Okay. So I will be providing you the recording of today's session as well. So don't worry about that. So I will be providing the recording as well. So once we end our session, so Zoom will take some time to process this recording. Once the recording is ready, then I will be sharing this recording of this today's session with you guys. Okay. So I will paste the link of our recording in our communicative link. Apart from that, I will be sharing the notes with you guys. So whatever notes I'm going to create, all those notes I will be sharing with you. And like this, lot of workshops I'm going to conduct from now on different topics. So some topics might be related to React, some topics might be related to Node.js, some topics might be related to HTML, CSS. Like this, I will be covering a lot of workshops. Okay. And all those recordings will be available with you guys. So whenever you guys get time, you guys can revise those topics. So let's start with promises in JavaScript. So how many of you have the idea what are promises in JavaScript? How many of you have the idea what are promises in JavaScript? So my first question is, what is promise? So if you know, just you can ping on the chat. Okay, so let's do one thing. If I'm asking something and if you know the answer, then simply just type 1. 1 means you know the answer. It's like yes. You can type 0 if you don't know something. If I'm asking something and if you don't know, just type 0. Okay. So how many of you know what is promises in JavaScript? Okay. There might be some people who are aware about promises in JavaScript, right? Maybe there are a lot of people who don't know what are promises in JavaScript. So before we understand what is promise, everyone should know what is object in JavaScript. Object in JavaScript. What is object in JavaScript? Because promise is completely dependent on this topic called object in JavaScript. Okay, let me just revise what is object in JavaScript. Basically, object in JavaScript is nothing but it is a simple data structure. It is a simple data structure. Or in very easiest way, we can say that object is a data structure in JavaScript. It is a simple data structure where we can store some data, or we can manage the data. So what is object? Object is a data structure in JavaScript where we can store some data and we can manage that data. The purpose of object is to store the data. Or don't disturb the session, guys. I have to disable annotations. Okay. What is the purpose of object? The purpose of object is to store the data, And whatever data we are going to store in the object, that data we store in the property format. So in property format, data will be stored. Data will be stored in the object. Okay, it's very simple to understand what is object. Object is a simple data structure. It is a simple data structure in your JavaScript. It is a simple data structure in your JavaScript. What is the purpose of this object? Why do we use this object in our JavaScript? To store the data, to store the data. And whatever data we are going to store in that object, that data we store in the property format, something called property format. Property format means every data that you store in the object will be in the key value format. Whatever data you will store in the object, that data will be in the key value format. Key value format. Every data will have some kind of key and value. Value is actually the data and key is like a reference to access that data. Key is like a reference to access that data. So there are multiple ways to create object in JavaScript. So I won't go in depth for this object concept. So let me just show you one of the way how we create object in JavaScript, that is using literal way, using your literal notation. So if you want to create any object in JavaScript, what we do, basically we create a variable here where something like object, something, some name we will give. For example, here I will say users object equals to open curly brace, close curly brace. This is how we create the object in JavaScript. And now what we can do inside this object, now this is the object. Now what we can do inside this object, we can store the data. Let's assume that I want to store some data which is related to a specific user. Like I want to store user name, user gender, maybe user ID. These three information I want to store. So whatever information you will store in the object, it should be in the key value pair. It should be in the key value pair. For example, if I want to store ID of any user, then the data will be stored like this: ID colon some data. It will be stored something like this. So now here we are storing the ID of the user, where this part is considered as a key, this part is considered as a value. And this entire thing we call as a property. This entire thing we call as a property. In the same way, if I want to store user name, then that information also we store in the key value format. For example, I can use here key as a name and value as a some kind of name. For example, Sagar. So here this entire thing we are going to call as a property. In that, this part is a key and this part is your value. This part is your value. So this is how we create object in JavaScript. This is one of the way. This is one of the way. So there are multiple ways using which we can create object. We can create using constructor concept also. We can use, we can create object using your class concept as well. So there are multiple ways to create the object. And one of the way is whatever I have explained here. Okay, this comes under your basics of JavaScript. So you should be aware of this concept before you try to learn promises. So that's why I just covered this topic as a revision part. So what is object? Object is a simple data structure. It is a simple data structure in JavaScript. What is the purpose of the object? The purpose of object is to store the data. To store the data. Whatever data we are going to store in this object, whatever data we store in this object, that will be in the property format. That will be in the property format. Now here, this part we are going to call as a property. This entire thing we are going to call as a property. And in that, this part we call as a key. And this part we are going to call as a value. We are going to call as a value. So this entire thing is a property. Okay. And if I just scroll down, this part is your key and this part is your value. This part is your value. That's it. So this is how we create object in JavaScript. Let me show practically one example. So let's suppose I want to create one object in JavaScript. So first we have to create one JavaScript file. Create one simple variable with whatever name you want to give. So I'm giving here user obj. This is a variable. You can use any scope statement. You can use let, const, var, any scope statement you can use. This is your variable name. Now to this variable, we have to assign one object. The moment you assign one object to your variable, now this variable will be considered as an object name. This variable name will be considered as an object name. Now inside this object, we can store the data. Suppose I want to store ID. So first you decide what should be the key. So I am assuming that, okay, key should be ID, colon, then value. What should be the value? Just giving some kind of value. I want to store one more information like username. So for that, you should have some key, that is name, colon, some value, for example, Sagar. Now, this is how we create the object in JavaScript. So in this object, we are storing two informations, the ID of the user and the name of the user. Like this, you can store any number of information related to this user. Okay, this was the object concept. Okay, very briefly, I tried to make you guys understand what is object. Have you guys understood whatever I have explained till here? Let me know on the chat. If you understood, just type 1. If you did not understand, type 0. Okay, instead of typing y, yes, yes or no, we can just use shortcuts, a logical way to answer the things. Okay, great. Now let's come back here. Now let's understand what is promise. What is promise in JavaScript? This is our actual topic. Promise in JavaScript. So before I explain what is promise in JavaScript, any one of you who knows the answer, can you tell me what is promise in JavaScript? So I will allow you guys to unmute yourself. Okay, because we have less crowd, 26 members only. So if you want to speak something, you can unmute yourself and you can speak. So anybody knows what is promise? Okay, I got 2 answers. Anybody else wants to express what are promises in JavaScript? Okay, nice. Okay, so I got few answers. Let me mute everyone. So what are promises in JavaScript means? Promises are a special object. Remember, they are special object in JavaScript. What are promises? Promises are special object in JavaScript where we can store some information. Where we can store some information, or we can simply say we can store information, or we can say data or data. What is promise? Promises or promise are special object. They are special object in JavaScript where we can store information or data. where we can store information or data. Now, we guys know what is object, right? Object is a data structure. So indirectly, I can say that promises are also some special data structure. Promises are also some special data structure where we can store some data or we can manage the data. We can manage the data. So indirectly, I can say that promises are special data structure where we can store and manage the data. Manage the data. Where we can store and manage the data. Technically, how you can define what is promises means? Simply, this is what you have to say. Promises are a special object in JavaScript where we can store or we can store information or data. That's why I revised this object concept. Because to understand what is promise, we should be very clear with object. What is object? Indirectly, if you want, you can explain your promises in this way also. Now, whatever data we store in the promise, whatever data or information we store in the promise, it is categorized. That data or information is categorized into two types. So the data of promise is categorized into two types. So whatever data we store in the promise, that data is categorized into two types. The first type is success data, and second type is failure, or we can call it as a error data. So whatever data we store in the promise, it is categorized into two types: success data, failure data. What is the meaning of this? For example, if you created a promise, let's assume that you created like this one promise. Now in this promise, we can store some data. Let's assume that I am storing some data. Now this data we can categorize into success data or error data. So we can divide this data into success data or error data. So some data we can call it as a success data, some data we can call it as a error data. So whatever data you store in the promise, that data you can call as a success data or error data. Now we have to understand which data you will call as a success data and which type of data you will call as a error data. That we need to understand. So inside the promise, we can store some data. Whatever data you store, that data is categorized into success data, error data. Some data are called success data, some type of data are called error data. Now we need to understand which type of data is called success data, which type of data is called failure data. To understand that success and failure data, we have to first of all understand how to create a promise. So if you know how to create a promise and how to store the data in the promise, if you come to know these two process, then you will be able to categorize your data into success or failure. Once you know how to create promise, once you know how to store the data in that promise, then you will be able to categorize. You will be able to categorize your data or your information into success data or error data. So first, let's try to understand how to create promise. How to create a promise object. How to create a promise object. Then I will explain which type of data we call as a success data, which type of data we call as a failure or error data. Okay. So how to create a promise? So to create promise, we use new operator. We use new operator and promise constructor. We use something called promise constructor. It is a predefined constructor. Predefined constructor. So to create a promise, we use new operator. New is a special operator in the JavaScript. And we use promise constructor. We use promise constructor. Okay, what is promise constructor? It is a special constructor in your JavaScript. It is a predefined constructor. Already this constructor is created by your JavaScript people. So we have to just use this constructor and new operator to create the promise. So let me explain you practically how to create it. So for this, I am creating one JavaScript file, promise.js. Suppose I want to create a promise. How to create a promise means directly you can use new operator like this, space, use promise constructor. How to use promise constructor? The name of the promise should start with the uppercase, like P should be in the uppercase, then you have to write promise. And then open parenthesis, close parenthesis. So this part we call as a constructor, and this is a special operator. It is a predefined constructor. Already this constructor is created by JavaScript. So we have to directly use it. So new operator, promise constructor. Now this promise constructor will take one argument, and that one argument is one callback function. So just pass one callback function here. And this callback function will take two parameters. The first parameter is resolve and second parameter is reject. Second parameter is reject. So what this new operator and promise constructor will do? It will create one promise. It will create one promise object and it will return that promise object. If it is returning that promise object, we can hold that promise object in one of the variable. We can hold that promise object in one variable. I will say here promise object. So this is how we create a promise object. Let me re-explain how to create a promise object. We use new operator, space. We have to call constructor here now, promise constructor. This is how we call the promise constructor. So whenever you use new operator and promise constructor, internally it will create one promise object and it will return that promise object. If it is returning that promise object, we can hold or we can store that promise object in one of the variable. Now this part will return one promise object, so we are holding in one variable. So inside this variable, promise object will be stored. Now this promise constructor will take one argument, that is one callback function. That is one callback function. And this callback function will take two parameters. The first parameter is resolve and reject. Now these are just parameters. You can give whatever name you want. You can give x comma y also. If you want to give the names as a x comma y, you can give it. Whatever names you want to give for these parameters, you can give. But generally, we use two predefined names for giving these parameter names. And those two predefined names are resolve and reject. Reject. That's it. This is how we create the promise. This is how we create the promise object. So here your promise object is created. Now see, if I do console.log of this promise object, and if I run this file, this promise object will be printed in my terminal. Now, if I come back here and if I just say node space, if I run my file, now see one promise object is printing. So it is printing one object, and this object is a promise type. So this is just a simple label which indicates that this is a promise object. And here you are able to find some label like pending. What is that pending? We will discuss. So this is your object. This is your promise object. So right now in this object, we did not store any data. We did not store any data. So it's like an empty promise object. Right now it is an empty promise object. So whenever you see a label called pending, it indicates that a promise object is created, and in that promise object there is no data. In the promise object there is no data. So it's like an empty promise object. So here let me add that point. Pending label indicates promise object is empty. Promise object is empty. Pending label indicates promise object is empty. So just we learned how to create a promise object. That's it. Okay. Now let's understand how to store some data in that promise object, or how to insert data in the promise object. How to insert or store data in the promise object. Right now we know how to create promise object. We created a promise object. But what is the use of promise object? The purpose of promise object is to store the data. So now we are going to learn how to store the data in the promise object, or how to insert the data in the promise object. That is what we have to learn. So anybody knows the answer? How to store or insert the data in the promise object? Like if you have some knowledge on it, feel free to express on the chat. How to store or insert the data in the promise object? Anybody knows? Okay, answer is very simple. Using two predefined functions. Called resolve and reject. There are two predefined functions, resolve and reject. Resolve and reject. So using two predefined functions called resolve and reject, we can store data in the promise object. Data in the promise object. Using two predefined functions called resolve and reject, we can store data in the promise object. These are two predefined functions. So these two predefined functions will be stored inside the two parameters of that callback function. So here we have a callback function, right? This is the callback function. Now this callback function is taking two parameters, resolve and reject. So by default, your JavaScript engine will store resolve function in the first parameter and reject function in the second parameter. Who will store resolve and reject function in this parameter? Your JavaScript will store. So you will be able to access those resolve and reject function using these parameters. This is the reason why we prefer to take these parameter names as a resolve and reject. This is the reason why we prefer to take these parameter names as a resolve and reject. Because in this first parameter, always resolve function will be stored. In this second parameter, reject function will be stored. Using these two functions, we can store the data in this promise object. We can store the data in this promise object. So that is what I have explained. So using two predefined functions called resolve and reject, we can store the data in the promise object. We can access resolve and reject function using two parameters which are defined in the callback function of promise constructor. We can access resolve and reject functions using two parameters which are defined in the callback function of promises constructor. Okay, this is your promise constructor. In that, you have that two parameters. So this part. Using resolve and reject. So using this resolve, we can store the data in the promise object. Using reject, we can store the data in the promise object. Both are used to store the data in the promise object. So how to store the data in the promise object? Let me show you. First, let me show you with the resolve. So I will just copy this code. I will paste here. Okay, I am creating a separate file called resolve.js. So here we will learn, here we will see how to add or store data in the promise object using resolve function. So this is my callback function. So in this callback function, inside this callback function, you can call resolve or reject. You can simply call here that resolve function. You can call like this. And in this resolve function, or to this resolve function, whatever argument you will pass, that argument or that data will be stored in the promise object. For example, to this resolve, I am passing 100 like this. If I am passing 100, this 100 will go and store inside this promise object. Who will store this 100 in the promise object? This resolve function. So this resolve function will store this 100 in the promise object. Just see here, if I save my file and if I run it, node space, if I say resolve here. Now see, inside your promise object, 100 is stored. 100 is stored. Inside your promise object, 100 is stored. Suppose I want to store one string, then what can I do? That string data, that data you can pass as an argument to resolve function. Suppose I am passing here Sagar. Save it. Node resolve. Now see, inside your promise, Sagar is stored. So whatever data you will pass as an argument, that data will be stored in the promise. Okay, so here let me add a point. Whatever data we pass as a argument, whatever data we pass as a argument to the resolve function, to the resolve function, to the resolve function. That data will be stored in the promise object, in the promise object. We can store any type of data in the promise object. Any type of data we can store in the promise object. Any type of data means you can store number type of data, or you can store string, or you can store boolean, or you can store object, you can store one array, you can store any type of data in the promise object. You can store any type of data in the promise object. Okay, let me just take the screenshot and let me add here. So all these notes will be very useful for you guys whenever you are revising it. So what this resolve function will do? This resolve function will add this data, this Sagar data, it will add inside this promise object. It will add that data inside this promise object. You can pass any type of data. Suppose I want to store one object. Let's assume that I want to store one object inside this promise. So what you need to do? Simply you have to pass one object. So in this object, I am saying name as a Sagar, and here gender like male. Now this object will be stored in the promise object. Inside your promise object, you will find this object. So let me show you. Let me run this. Now see, this is your promise object. From here to here, inside that you have one more object. One more object. So this is how we store the data inside the promise object using resolve function. And whatever data we store in the promise object using resolve function, whatever data you store in the promise object using resolve function, that data is called success data. That data is called success data. Whatever data we store using resolve function, in the promise object, that data is called success data. That data is called success data. So what is success data? Success data is that data which is stored in the promise object using resolve function. So whatever data we store using resolve function in the promise object, that data is called success data. You can store any type of data, number, string, array, object, whatever data you store. If you are storing using resolve, that data is called success data. In the same way, how we are able to store the data in the promise object using resolve? In the same way, we can store the data in the promise object using reject function also. Using the reject function also, we can store the data inside the promise object. So here I will say how to add or store the data in the promise object using reject function. Here I will say reject. I will remove this resolve part now. Now here I will call reject function. Now to this reject function also, whatever argument you will pass, for example, I am passing 100. Now this data will be stored in the promise object by reject. So reject will store this data in the promise object. Now see, if I just run this file, see here, observe here, I'm storing the data using reject function. Node reject. If you see here, this is the promise object. Here you are able to see some label called rejected and your data is here. Using reject also, we can store any type of data in our promise object. You can store like this number, or you can store string also. Something went wrong. Like this, I'm storing one string. So if I run my file, now see, this is your promise object. Inside this, one string is stored. And there is a label called rejected. There is a label called rejected. This label indicates it is a error data. It is a error data. Or this label indicates the data we stored in the promise object. The data we stored in the promise object is using reject function. Using reject function. So this label indicates data stored in this promise object is using reject function. Is using reject function. So if you have a pending label, it means in that promise object there is no data. If you have a reject label, it means in this promise object you stored the data using reject function. If you don't find any label, it means in that promise object you have stored the data using resolve function. Using resolve function. Reject, resolve, and then we have pending. These are the three states of promise. So if I come back here, and if I just take the screenshot of it, and I can paste here. I can paste here. Okay. So here I will add the point. Whatever data we store or whatever data we pass as a argument to reject a function. Whatever data we pass as an argument to reject a function, that data will be stored in the promise object. In the promise object. That data will be stored in the promise object. Okay. And here one more point we have to understand is data stored in the promise object, using reject function is called error or failure data. Data stored in the promise object using reject function is called error or failure data. Data stored in the promise object using reject function is called error or failure data. I hope you understood, right? What is success data? What is error data now? Okay, if I revise what we have learned, we have started our discussion with what is promise. So we know that promise is a special object in JavaScript. It is a special object. What is the purpose of this object? The purpose of this object is to store information or data. Okay. Then I have told that whatever data we store in the promise, that data is categorized into two types: success data and failure data. Now we know which data is called success data. So inside this promise, if you store the data using resolve, then that data we call as a success data. In the promise, if you store the data using reject, then that data we can call as a failure or error data. It can be any data, but if you are storing that data in the promise using reject, it is called failure or error data. If you store the data using resolve, it is called success data. It is called success data. Then I have explained you how to create a promise object. Then we learned how to store the data in the promise object. Once promise object is created, how to store the data inside that using resolve and reject. So if you store the data using resolve, it is success. If you store the data using reject, it is failure. That is what I have documented here. That is what we have learned. How many of you understood up to here? So you should understand what is promise, purpose of promise, how to create promise, how to store data in promise, what is success data, what is failure or error data, what is resolve, what is reject. So if you understood all these points, it means whatever I have explained, everything you understood. If you have the answers for all these points, it means you understood whatever I have explained till now. Whatever I have explained till now. So how many of you understood? How many of you did not understand? If you understood type 1, if you did not understand type 0. Great. Okay, now let's understand the states of promise. There are 3 states of promise. There are 3 states of promise. The first state we call as a pending state. First state we call as a pending state. Second state we call as a fulfilled state. Fulfilled, or you can call it as a resolved state. Third is rejected, or we call it as a failure state. Failure state. Or generally people call it as a rejected state only. Okay, let me add rejected state. These are the 3 states of promise. These are the 3 states of promise. In your interviews, they will ask, can you explain me 3 states of promise? 3 states of promise. Or they can ask you, can you list out 3 states of promise? So we can say that there are 3 states of promise, that is pending state, fulfilled state, rejected state. What is the meaning of pending state? What is the meaning of pending state? The meaning of pending state is promise object is created, but in that promise object, there is no data. It's like an empty promise object. So if you find any promise object state as a pending, so in that case, you have to assume that this promise is an empty object. This promise is an empty object. It means in that promise, there is no data. It's a just empty promise object. If you identify any promise object as a fulfilled state or resolved state, if you identify any promise state as a fulfilled or resolved, in that case, you have to assume that a promise object is created, and in that promise object, data is stored using resolve function. Or you can assume that promise contains success data. Promise contains success data. Pending state means promise object is empty. Promise object is empty. Fulfilled or resolved state means promise object contain success data. Success data. You know what is success data now. If someone say rejected state, a promise is in the rejected state, or if you identify a promise is rejected, in that case, you can assume that promise object contains failure or error data. Failure or error data. So using the states of promise, you will be able to identify exactly what your promise contains, whether it contains success data, failure data, or no data, So these are the states of promises: pending state, fulfilled or resolved state, or rejected state. There are 3 states of promise. Is it clear, guys? What are the states of promise? Great. So we have learned what is promise, how to store the data in the promise, what is resolve, reject, what are the states of the promise. What are the states of the promise? We are aware about all these things now. We are aware about all these things now. Okay. Now let's understand how to access the data of promise. 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 Let's assume that someone created promise. They stored some data in the promise, and he is giving that promise object to us. Let's assume that someone created a promise. He stored some data in the promise. Now we don't know whether in that promise success data is stored or failure data is stored. We don't know that. He is directly giving that promise to us. Now somehow we have to access the data of that promise. Nothing but we have to get the data from that promise and we have to use it. Somewhere we have to use it. So we should know how to access the data of promise. How to access the data of promise. So there are 2 ways to access the data of promise. There are 2 ways to access the data of promise. And they are the first one is using then and catch. There are 2 predefined functions called then and catch. Using then and catch predefined functions. And one more way is using async await. Using async and await. These are the 2 ways using which we can access the data from the promise. We can access the data from the promise. Using then and catch and using async await. So in this workshop, I will explain you how to access the data using then and catch. I will release one video on how to handle the promise using async and await. How to handle the promise using async and await. For that, I will release one video. I will release one video. And that video link I will post in our WhatsApp. So you will be able to find both the ways. And in lot of interviews, they will ask both the ways. Sometimes in your applications, you might use this way to handle your promise, or sometimes you might use this way. So better to know both the ways. It's mandatory that everyone should know both the ways. Okay, first let's understand how to access data of the promise using then and catch. So let me go to my VS Code. I will close these files. I will create one more file called access promise data.js. Okay, this is our file name. Now here, first let me create one promise. So already we have written the logic side to create promise. So let me just copy this one. Let's assume that we are creating the promise object. A promise object is created. And in that promise object, we are storing the data using resolver function. And this data is stored in the promise object. Now here, if I do console.log, of promise object, it will print a promise object. And in that promise object, whatever data you have, it will print that data also. So if I say here, node space our file name and click on enter. Now see, it is printing a promise object. From here to here, we have a promise object. In that we have our object. So I want to access this object, which is inside the promise. I want to access this object. So how to access this object means using then and catch. How to access promise object. How to access the data of promise object. So for this, what we have to do, on our promise object, we have to call then and catch function. On our promise object, we have to call then and catch function. How to call then and catch function on our promise object? How to call then and catch on promise object? So for this, what you have to do? You have to take the promise object dot, you have to say dot, then you have to call then function directly like this. After then again dot, you have to call catch function. This is how we call then and catch on the promise object. How to call? On your promise object, add dot, then call then function. After that, add again one more dot, call catch function. This is how we call then and catch on the promise object. Yeah, is my voice audible, guys? Okay. So just there is a power cut at my end. I have rejoined it. Okay. So how to call then and catch on promise object? This is the syntax. So here I am calling it. Now suppose in this promise object, if you store success data, if this promise object contains success data, in that case, then will be called. Suppose promise object contains error data. In that case, catch will be called. So depending upon the data in this promise object, depending on the data in this promise object, then or catch, remember then or catch will be called. In between these two, any one will be called. And that depends upon what data you stored in this promise object. So let me add that point here as well. If promise object contains success data, in that case, then will be called. Then function will be called. In that case, then function will be called. If promise object contains error or failure data, in that case, catch function will be called. Catch function will be called. It is very, 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 very important to know. If promise object contains success data, in that case, then will be called. If promise object contains error or failure data, in that case, catch will be called. In that case, catch will be called. Now tell me, in this promise object, in this current promise object, what type of data we have? Success data or failure data? In this promise object right now, what type of data is stored? Success data. So in this case, which function will be called? Then will be called or catch will be called? In this case, then will be called. Now this both then and catch, will take one argument. This function, then function will take one argument, catch function will take one argument. And both the arguments are callback functions. It means then will take one callback function and catch will take one callback function. So this both the function takes callback functions. Okay, let me come back here. Let me add here this screenshot. And before that, let me add this screenshot also. Before callback function, let me add this screenshot. So on the promise object, we are going to call our then and catch. Now both this then and catch will take one callback function as an argument. And this both the callback functions. So then callback function will take one parameter. It will take one parameter. We call that parameter as a success data. Catch will also take one callback function. And that callback function will also take one parameter. We call it as a error data. Then and catch both will take one argument that are callback functions. Again, those callback functions will take one parameter. So then's callback function will take a parameter called success data. Catch callback function parameter will take error data. Now suppose this promise object contains success data. In that case, then will be called. Internally, then will call this callback function. It will call this callback function. And whatever data you have in the promise, that data will be copied. Inside this parameter. Suppose your promise object contains success data. In that case, then will be called. Internally, then will call this callback function. And whatever data you have in the promise, it will be copied. In this first parameter. So what I will do here, I will add one console.log. And I will say that then executed. And in next callback, in next line, again, I will add console.log. And here I will print the value of success data. This parameter value I will print here. In the same way, these two console statements I will add here also. Here I will say catch executed. And here I will say failure, here I will say error data. Error data. Now let's see what it will execute. So let me remove this console. Now let's see, these two consoles will execute or these two consoles will execute. So right now in our promise object, we have stored the data using resolve. It means our promise object contains success data. If it contains success data, in that case, then will be executed. Internally, then we'll call this callback function. And whatever data you have in the promise, it will be copied in this parameter. And now this line will execute. Whenever this line executes, this sentence as it is, it will print in our terminal. Then this line will execute. Whenever this line executes, in this parameter, whatever data is there, that data will be printed in the terminal. So let's try here. Now see, here then executed. And see, whatever data we are storing in the promise, exactly that data got printed. Now here it is not printing promise object. It is printing the data of the promise object. Here it is printing the data of the promise object. Suppose here I am storing, instead of storing the data using resolve, if I am storing the data using reject. Now see, using reject, I am storing the data in the promise object. So now this data will be considered as a error data. Now this promise object contains failure or error data. If this promise object contains error or failure data, in that case, catch will be called. Internally, catch will call this callback function. And whatever data you have in the promise, that data will be stored inside this parameter. And now this console will execute. Then this console will execute. Let's try. Just what change I done? Here, instead of using resolve, I have used reject now. I have done the changes and I have made it reject. Let's try now. If I run this, now see, here we got catch executed. And here if you see, that data is printing. So either catch will execute or then will execute. So using this then and catch, we can access the data. Yeah, which part is not clear? Revati, which part is not clear? Okay. So it's something like this. We have a promise object. Let's assume that this is our promise object. In this, we have a data. There is some data stored in the promise object. Now we don't know this data is a success data or error data. So what we did on this promise object, we are calling then and catch. We are calling both the function. Now, depending upon data, what data you stored in the promise object, In that case, then will be called or catch will be called. Depending upon this data on this promise object, then will be called or catch will be called. Or catch will be called. When then will be called? If this data is a success data. In this promise, if you have a success data, if you have a success data, in that case, then will be called. If you have failure data, suppose this data is failure, or error data. In that case, catch will be called. So this is what your promise is all about. So we should know all these points. We should know all these points. We should know all these points. Apart from that, we should know what is catch. And we should know how to access data from promise object. We should know how to access the data from promise object. If you know this much, means you can crack any interview on the promise object. You can crack any interview on the promise object. These are the minimum things you should know in the promise. These are the minimum things you should know in the promise. And apart from that, we know the states of promise as well. States of promise. We know what are the states of promise. And here, the process of accessing the data from the promise object is called handling the promise. Handling the promise. What is handling the promise? Handling the promise is nothing but it is just a process of accessing the data from the promise object. So sometimes you might access success data, sometimes you might access failure data. That process we call as a handling the promise. Handling the promise. So the process of accessing the data from the promise object is called handling the promise. Understood, guys, all these things? Okay. So what I will do, I will stop the session here. Right now, there is no power at my end. And almost battery is also 0. So I will just stop here because almost it's like 1 hour 30 minutes, right? Or 1 hour 15 minutes session we have taken. That's more than enough in the online. More than that, if I take, everything will go out of your head. So 1 hour 15 minutes session we have taken. This recording I will provide. To you guys. Okay, so that recording will be available to you for lifetime. And I will provide you this paint file. And whatever coding part I have done, that code files also I will provide you. So how you will be able to access recording paint file code? So for that, I have created here one repository. Okay, this is the repository, GitHub repository, where I will update our paint files and our notes. Okay, save this repository with you. Here I will update. Here I will update the recording link. I will update the recording link once that recording is available. And here I will update our WhatsApp community link as well. Suppose if someone is not joined, they can join here, or you guys can share your with your friends. So whenever next workshop I will take, so they will be notified. So if possible, just share with your friends, whoever wants to learn. Okay, just share with the serious people who are serious to learn. That's it. And anyways, recording link also I will paste in our WhatsApp, plus this entire GitHub link also I will paste in the WhatsApp. Okay. So this is the GitHub repository link. So if you just click on that link like this, if you click on that link, you will be able to find here. And here you have a code option. Click on this code option. You will get download option. Click on download. Okay. So once you click on the link which I have provided, you will land on this page. Now here you have a code option. Just click on this code drop down button. You will find here download option. If you click on download, whatever I have updated here, everything will be downloaded. It will be downloaded in your system. So save this repository, save this repository. Anyways, I will add in WhatsApp also. So in case if you are not able to copy it, you can copy from the WhatsApp. Okay, like this, I will be conducting a lot of workshops on different topics which are complicated. So in future, I will explain about the flex concept, grid concept. Then we will have a workshop on DOM. I will take workshops on CSS animations, different topics of React. Okay. So React testing, how to do unit testing, how to write unit tests for your React applications, Node applications. In Java, there is a collection topic. So whatever complicated topics are there, on that I will be conducting the workshops from now. So whenever you feel you want to attend some workshop, feel free to attend it. Yeah, that's all, guys. If you don't have any doubts, yeah, you guys can drop. Let's meet in some other workshop. Yeah, next workshop I will conduct on React only. Yeah, async await link I will provide. Okay, I will record a video on that, how to handle promise using async await. That link also I will provide.